Each month we focus on a particular theme for our weekly services. And for the month of September, we will focus on the concept of freedom. Freedom! We use that word a lot in our country. I mean, what do you think of when you hear freedom? Do you feel like you live in a free country? I mean, what does freedom even mean in the context of a country? Modern thinking on freedom is usually focused on the individual, on the ability to do or say whatever we want to as an individual. Biblical freedom, on the other hand, is not just focused on the individual. Freedom in the Bible is about being part of a community that is free from oppression and that is free from poverty. Biblical ideas about freedom arose out of the experience of slavery. So freedom and liberty in the Bible usually refer to living in a community that's free of that kind of oppression. There are entire books of the Bible about the quest for this kind of freedom. The book of Exodus is the story of how Moses led a community of enslaved people to freedom. Then after Moses escaped Egypt, Moses designed a way of life that was intended to limit the various kinds of enslavement and oppression that they had encountered in Egypt. So the law of Moses was an attempt to use laws or rules to establish a freer society than what they had just left. In many cases, this kind of community-wide oppression is the consequence, often the brutal consequence, of the exercise of individual freedom by very powerful people. Powerful people historically, one way or another, enslaved the weak in order to achieve their perfect life, because they've got the power to do so. And this is important to understand about freedom. The lack of freedom we tend to read about in the Bible was usually a consequence, the flip side of a powerful individual's exercise of his own freedom. A king or a pharaoh or wealthy slave owner. The law of Moses was an attempt to minimize or moderate the harmful consequences of the powerful exercising their freedom in ways that cause suffering for the weak and for the poor. It was a big step forward, the law of Moses. The law of Moses included limits on how much people were allowed to be oppressed by the powerful. For example, in ancient times, if someone owed you money and you did not pay, you could enslave them until the debt was paid. The law of Moses put limits on such slavery. A wealthy person could only enslave you for a certain amount of time, no matter how much money was owed. Then later in the Bible, Jesus comes along and he teaches us to never use debts as a mean to control or enslave others. Jesus teaches us to forgive debts instead. One of the purposes behind the law of Moses in the Old Testament was to put some limits on the freedom, on the ability of powerful people to do whatever they wanted in order to protect and enhance the freedom of the least powerful. The law of Moses does not in any way support authoritarianism. As you may remember, under the law of Moses, there was not even supposed to be a king, although that didn't last very long. Being free of oppression, which was a widespread need in biblical times, was difficult. It was seen as a great gift from God. To be free from a biblical perspective is to be free from unjust laws, to be free of incarceration, to be free of debt, to be free of poverty. Receiving the gift of biblical freedom was not just about being free to do whatever we want to do as individuals. It just wasn't about that. And it's within this context of freedom that the passage from Isaiah that we heard today was written. Today's scripture passage from Isaiah focuses on biblical freedom, even if we likely read it in individual ways today. It was the passage, as I already mentioned, from Isaiah that Jesus himself chose to read, to hold up when he visited his hometown. So Isaiah mentions purpose and freedom, a connection I'll talk about shortly. Isaiah starts out with his purpose, with the reason God called him. And by extension, this is Christ's calling as well, and maybe our calling too. Isaiah says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Why? To bring good news to the oppressed. This purpose, to be good news for the oppressed, for the poor, for those in prison, is a very pure and sacred purpose that's found throughout the Bible. Isaiah continues, to proclaim freedom to the captors, to release the prisoners. Notice there's no qualification in terms of why someone is captive or why someone is in prison. Captivity and prison are not God's ideas of how humans should live. It is not how a spiritually free people should live. And it's not even how we should deal with crime, except maybe in the most extreme cases. Isaiah goes on to say his purpose is to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, this may seem a little cryptic if we're not familiar with the Old Testament anti-oppression laws, but the year of the Lord's favor was a specific kind of economic system called Jubilee that was included in the law of Moses. Jubilee, or the year of the Lord's favor, was a system within the law of Moses intended to limit economic oppression. In a Jubilee year, all slaves had to be released. All land and all wealth will return to the temple, and then were divided up amongst the people equally. Every 50 years this would happen. Every Jubilee, everyone starts over again as economic equals. The law of Moses puts a time limit on economic power and wealth. Economic oppression stands in direct violation of community freedom, and under the law of Moses, economic gain was limited to a certain time period. Using our modern understanding of freedom, the Pharaoh of Egypt back in Moses' day, he was free, right? Using a modern definition, he could literally do whatever he wanted, even if it came at great cost to others. In contrast, the prophet Isaiah teaches that if we want to work for freedom, if we want to be freedom fighters in a biblical sense, we should work to lift up the oppressed and the poor. That's what a freedom fighter does in Isaiah's thinking and in Jesus Christ's teachings. Comfort those who are mourning. Release those who are imprisoned. Shelter those who are homeless. And that message is echoed in many other places in the Bible. Now, times have changed. We don't think of freedom outside of an individual context very much anymore. We think of freedom in ways that mostly benefit the powerful. During our meditation today, we did a little experiment on freedom as we see it today, as you saw it, by imagining what our ideal life would be like. And that was an individualistic approach, and that's okay. What would our perfect life be as an individual, including our role or function in the world? If tomorrow morning you had the freedom to wake up into your perfect life, as you define it, what's that going to look like? Now, some of us have never bothered to visualize our perfect life. And there's several big reasons why visualizing a perfect life, a perfectly free life, can be difficult for us. First, it's really hard to envision a perfect life if we don't know our own purpose in life. If we have a clear purpose in life, when we have a clear purpose in life, we tend to use our freedom to further that purpose. If our purpose is to be a doctor, many of the things we'll do will be aimed at that purpose. And once we're a doctor, our perfect day might involve finding a cure for cancer. When we don't know our purpose, visualizing our perfect or preferred future is clouded by our uncertain direction and our unknown destination. Having a purpose gives our life a steering wheel of sorts, an ability to use our freedom to get results that are in line with the reason that we are alive. We all have a purpose. We all have a reason for being here. Even the very young and the very old have purpose. Without a solid purpose in life, our actions can be used to fulfill that purpose if we have a solid purpose, assuming we're free to do that. So there's this connection between our purpose in life and freedom, a connection that can help us better understand ourselves and others. A misalignment between our purpose and how we use our freedom is an indication that we're not following our calling, that we're not yet involved in fulfilling our reason to be alive. For example, a spiritually aware person's perfect life will be filled with purpose and will avoid any freedom or actions that hurt or damage themselves or others. A spiritually mature or Christ-like person is not self-centered and therefore will not pursue any purpose at the expense of others. A spiritually mature person, according to Christ's teachings, will be driven by an unconditional and selfless love and by service to others. Without spiritual awareness, there is a danger that our freedom, our actions will come at the expense of others, and that our perfect world will be perfect for us, but not for anyone else. Love is also about the ability to balance individual freedom with how that freedom impacts others. The more spiritually aware we are, the more likely it is that we will use our freedoms based on love and our discernment of consequences. Too often, as a culture, we focus on the idea of freedom for the individual, freedom for the powerful, without thinking much about purpose or consequences. If we are self-absorbed, we can easily ignore the consequences of our freedom and our actions. This state of self-absorption, which is relatively common in our world today, is the opposite of being Christ-like. When we are mostly focused on ourselves, our perfect life will be all about us, about our power, our comfort, our enjoyment. For example, if our perfect life is to be rich and famous, and we have no purpose, then being rich and famous is just an ego trip. It's an indication we need to dig deeper. If you envision your perfect life as fame and fortune, ask yourself, what made you rich and famous? What was your purpose, your function in life that resulted in wealth and fame? We can be rich and famous for all the wrong reasons, if that's our main focus. If our main focus is ourselves rather than something more community-oriented. When we don't have a clear purpose in life, when we don't care about the consequences, our ideal life can degrade to whatever or whoever makes us feel good. You remember from the 60s, those of you who are old enough to remember, right? Say, if it feels good, do it. You remember that? Older folks will remember that. But the use of freedom for selfish reasons or without a clear purpose almost always has bad consequences for ourselves and for others. The ironic thing is that when we don't have an honorable purpose or we ignore the consequences of our freedom, we eventually lose our freedom in the process. When our purpose is to feel good, when it's all about me, our exercise of freedom can easily descend into laziness, drug or alcohol addiction, greed, abuse, and violence. We end up depressed, addicted, and alone. That's what happens when you use your freedom and you have no purpose, when it's all about ourselves, when it's selfishly deployed. We can quickly find ourselves in need of a new kind of freedom. Freedom from addiction. Freedom from the consequences of our own actions. Freedom from the results of our own poor decisions. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not supposed to be that way. We have the option of exercising our freedom in a purposeful, Christ-like way. in a way that is characterized by love. The point here is that freedom is not as simple as it seems, or as one-dimensional as is often understood in our culture. We in the United States hold up freedom as one of our highest ideals, right? Where is America? The home of the free, right? That's right. Where freedom rings. But notice we don't talk much about the purpose driving our freedom. We don't talk much about what the consequences of our freedom. Why is that? We don't talk much about whether our freedom inflicts damage on ourselves or others or damages our environment. For the USA to be considered free from a biblical standpoint, I feel we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, the USA is free for the powerful. It's free for the wealthy. Right? It's free for the people with the most money. But not so much for the poor, not for the sick, not for the homeless, not for the immigrant or the outsider. Did you know that the United States incarcerates a larger percentage of our population than most other countries? We're like in the top 5 worst countries in terms of how many of our citizens that we imprison. And as far as the sick, what about health care? How are we doing there? Well, man, if you're rich and powerful, we have the finest health care system in the world. If you are poor, good luck getting the care you need. The gains the U.S. managed to make to increase access to health care for more people in just the past couple of decades are now in the process of being rolled back. To become a free country in a biblical sense, we still got a long way to go. Every week when we're here together, we pray that God's will be done, both in our lives and in the community. That includes praying for freedom in a biblical sense, for ourselves and for our country. Praying that God help us engage in freedom in ways that are not damaging to ourselves or others. Praying that we use our freedom to understand and live out Christ's teachings. Our path of spiritual growth and our spiritual practice help us to find and refine our purpose in life as a church and as individuals, and to guide the use of our freedom in loving ways. Having a dream and living into that dream is one of the greatest gifts of life. When our purpose is social justice, when our purpose is reducing economic oppression and other structures of power that oppress people, we are engaged in one of the most sacred uses of freedom documented in the Bible. When our purpose is welcoming the stranger, feeding the hungry, reaching out to the lonely, helping the sick, we are exercising our freedom characterized by love for God and love for neighbor, as Jesus Christ taught. Biblical freedom, love-inspired freedom, is by its nature good news for the poor. It's good news for the weak. It's good news for the oppressed, the sick, the left behind, the incarcerated. Exercising our freedom in a way that hurts ourselves or other people is not biblical freedom. It's not love-inspired freedom. It's not what Jesus taught. I pray that everything we do as a church is a reflection of this purpose, that like Christ, we too are good news for the poor, for the downtrodden, the homeless, for the immigrant, according to Christ's example.